Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to use a simple masking out technique to paint some beautiful white daisies. I first learnt this technique from Hugh Brading, a great teacher and artist from New Zealand about 20 years ago, and I've painted this subject many times since. It's always been very popular. Today I've decided to paint a composition with a few large daisies on a very dark blue background. I'm working on a piece of 140-pound watercolour paper, cold pressed here. It's about 11 by 16 inches, and using a soft pencil I'm just starting to sketch in the centres of the daisies. I'm scattering them more or less at random over the paper, and they look like a bunch of flying saucers now. And then the trick is to draw the circles around the centres to give you a guideline to where the petals are going to go. So just make a whole bunch of flying saucers or fried eggs, whatever you want to think of them as, and then put the petals in like this. If you make the circle on the outside slightly off center, then you'll get the impression of not only daisies facing, but some facing away, some going into the distance. In other words, your perspective will be quite good. And it also surprisingly makes them easier to draw. And now I'm just putting in some stems and some leaves. This needs to be very loose. There doesn't need to be any accuracy here. The faster you do it, the better really, because we're aiming for a loose painting. So a loose sketch is what you need to get yourself started. Don't worry about precision. That's not the point of this painting. This painting is all about colour and spontaneity. So once your drawing is finished and you're happy with the composition, a good scattering of flowers pretty much at random over the paper is what you're aiming for. Then we come to masking out. You'll need some masking fluid, which you can buy in bottles, and it's made by all the main manufacturers of paints. The one I'm using here is a Schminker one. It's a colourless one. The thing to do is, first of all, you need to make sure you don't use one of your best brushes for this, because the masking fluid reacts badly with them, especially if you're using, well, if you have a sable brush, that would be the end of the brush. Even nylon ones are affected badly by masking fluid. So find an old brush or one that the children have been using, especially something that you don't care about too much. Tip some of the masking fluid into a small china dish, like I've got here, and then apply thickly to your painting, covering all the areas that you want to reserve. So that's the flowers, the petals, and the centres, and the leaves and the stems. And make sure you put the masking fluid on fairly thickly, because otherwise it will be very, very difficult to get off. So once you've done that, then we let it dry and we come to the next stage. Make sure you leave your masking fluid to dry thoroughly. It needs, I would say, a good 24 hours. Find yourself a nice big brush and completely wet the whole sheet of paper over the whole thing. Make it nice and wet, not sopping wet, but nice and wet. And then leave it for a few minutes for the shine to go off the paper. You want to come to the next stage when the paper just starts to stop reflecting the light. And meanwhile, while you're waiting for that to happen, you can mix up the paint that you need for the next stage. I used a loose mixture of indigo, phthalo blue and ultramarine, which I mix in a separate little dish. I don't mix it up too thoroughly, so that as I dip my brush in, I'm going to pick up different colours as I go along, which gives me a nice random effect across the paper. I don't want this to go on too evenly. I want it to be a little bit random. You might want it to be more even, in which case you probably want to use a lot more paint. But this is the way this one's going to go. ultramarine down the bottom here mostly, and a nice area of indigo in the middle up here. And once you've covered the whole paper, don't fiddle around with it too much, just stop and let it dry. Once the paint that you've just put on is completely dry, it's going to take probably 24 hours, I expect, then you can come in and start to remove the masking fluid. Depending on the kind of masking fluid that you've used, which brand you've used, you might find different ways suitable to take it off. This particular brand, which is, like I said, Schminker, I found the best way was to actually use a fairly firm eraser to lift it off. It doesn't come off in strings like some masking fluid does. It comes off in tiny shreds, which is a bit of a pain in the neck. But it does at least come off without taking the paper up from underneath. Some masking fluid can be a bit tricky like that. Now, to paint the centres of the flowers, you're going to need 3 colours. I'm using transparent yellow here. You also need a medium orange, and I used Quinacridone Gold, and a very dark brown, and I used Sepia. So first thing to do is to paint in the circle of the centre of the daisies. And then once you've got all of those in, come back with Quinacridone Gold and just dot the colour around the outside edge, maybe covering up to about 1/3 of the centre of the flower, and just dab it in like this and then leave it so that it can spread into the yellow a little bit. If you feel it's a bit dark, you can lift out like that some of the colour just to adjust the lightness in the centre there. Now the third colour, which is Sepia, this is what makes the centres really pop. Just a few indications of sepia around the outside edge of the centres of the daisies to give the shadow effect. That, of course, will spread slightly into the rest of the centres, but it should give a very interesting and beautiful effect to the flowers. Okay, so we have now completed the first stage of the daisy flowers themselves, and we're going to start working on the foliage, the leaves. And the technique I use involves starting with a light colour, a light wash inside the leaf area of transparent yellow, and then dropping in olive green and Quinacridone Gold in a fairly random fashion. The idea being to create a semi-abstract effect in the foliage. We're not going for accuracy, but for colour here. And starting to shape the stalks of the flowers, putting in some dark green here. You'll notice that the stalks are very roughly painted, and we're going to shape them up a bit later on with some indigo, which is a good technique. I'm using dioxazine purple here to put some shadow areas on some of the leaves, allowing the paint to move, not really controlling it, but just directing it. This is sap green, I think, here, Quinacridone Gold. Very important colour on my palette. I have a restricted palette, a limited palette. I don't use 325 paints, even though Daniel Smith make them. I don't see any reason to have any more than a couple of dozen, and in any one painting I usually use probably absolute maximum of 10 colours and often no more than 5. The reason for this is because if you want the painting to be pleasing to the eye, the worst thing you can do is to overwhelm with too many colours. And now I'm working on the stems, and I'm bringing in some indigo, very dark blue, to start shaping up the petals and start shaping the shadows behind the stalks and the stalks themselves. And this is a very important part, because as you drop in the indigo, you'll see how the leaf shapes really leap forward and become much more dynamic. This is quite an exciting part of the painting process. You need to be a little bit bold when you come to this stage. Don't be afraid of the colours. They will not bite you. If we are going to keep the petals white, which is obviously what we want to do, then we need to paint the shadows of the petals very pale. And I'm using a very dilute wash of cobalt blue here. And bearing in mind, when it dries, it will dry lighter than it appears at the moment, so that's what we want. And just indicating the creases and the overlapping areas of the white petals, which gives the indication that the rest of the petals are pure white. So this is a delicate process, but quite fun, because as you do it, you see the flowers come to life. And here I've taken some slightly darker blue, and I'm going to create the petals on this fried egg, turning it from a fried egg into a flower. Although as I'm doing this, I'm wondering whether this flower doesn't want to be bigger, and we'll see what we come to do with that later. But this is a useful technique for emphasising the actual petal shape. Just basically, we call it negative painting. You're painting in the spaces around the petals. And now back to the pale shadows on the petals. Painting from the centre outwards, mostly, along the actual growth lines of the petals, rather than going side to side. When you look at a real daisy, of course, you'll see that the petals do overlap, and you can indicate that overlapping by where you put the shadow areas. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of the painting now and starting to deal with some of the fine details. I've got indigo on my smaller brush here, and I'm going to give the petals to the daisies a slightly more ragged appearance, shaping them to look a little bit more realistic. You can do as much or as little as you like of this, and partly it'll depend on how your masking fluid went on. Sometimes you'll get a very jagged edge where you put the masking on. I happened this time, for some reason, to get quite a smooth edge, which wasn't necessarily what I wanted, but anyway, it doesn't matter because you can fix it using a bit more dark paint. So just going around now and indicating the shapes. And here we have a little bit too much white. I think that was a random piece of masking, so I've covered part of it up and turned it into indication of a stem instead. And now I'm working with some quite thick white gouache. This is Winsor and Newton Designer Gouache, which is about as opaque as you can get with white paint. Don't use Chinese white, that won't cover anything, so you need gouache. Every watercolourist ought to have a tube of gouache in their kit. And I've decided to make these daisies a bit bigger, so I'm giving them some bigger petals and just giving them a new coat, a new dress, and basically thinking about the whole painting, it seemed to me that it needed a bit more white in the background there. I'm going to make this one bigger too, in order to make it balance better with there's three there, all the same size roughly. Well, that's no good. You don't want three of the same size, that's bad management, so we'll make that one much bigger. And then I'm going to use a little bit of gouache with some yellow to do the centre of that, to make that stand out. So I'll come back and do that in a second. And now I'm working on the petals of the larger flowers again with a bit of gouache. This is the alternative. You can either cut into the petals with the dark colour, or else you can extend them out a little bit to make them a little bit more random, a bit more attractive. Either technique works well. I use a bit of both. And if your shadows have gone a little bit too dark, you can always lighten them up with a bit of gouache. This is definitely the most important part of the painting, getting these final details right. What would we do without our tube of white gouache? Yes. Now you might say, well, why don't you just paint the daisies in white from the very start? Well, you wouldn't be able to have such a dark background. It's as simple as that. It wouldn't work. Or it would be very tedious. So I think I'm done now. Final flourish, 3 little stems. So there we are. Thank you for joining me in this adventure with white daisies. I hope you enjoyed it and that you decide to have a go. It's a super painting to do, a guaranteed crowd pleaser. So have fun and make it your own. Thanks again for being here, and please subscribe if you enjoyed this tutorial. Bye for now.